In this video, we're going to start thinking about how aerobic respiration can be linked to the energy that we need when we are exercising. When we're resting, for example, when we're asleep, we have a certain amount of energy that we need to keep the processes that are keeping us alive going. And so what you require is a certain amount of glucose and a certain amount of oxygen. And that's easily delivered around your body by your resting heart rate and a resting breathing rate. But when we start to exercise, and that could be a light walk or going for a run, the muscles that are working harder than they were when we were at rest. And so they require more energy, which is going to come from respiration. If they require more energy, then it would make sense that they would require more glucose and oxygen to be delivered to the cells and more carbon dioxide, which is the waste product, to be taken away. To do this, we see some interesting changes in your physiology. The first one is that we see an increase in your heart rate. It's important to get our heart rate up because, remember, the glucose and the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are transported around the body in the blood. By pumping more blood through the body per minute, what we'd expect to see is more oxygen being taken up by diffusion in the lungs and more carbon dioxide being excreted. We'd also get more glucose being picked up in the small intestine. So this oxygen and glucose-rich blood, there's more of it going to your muscles, and the carbon dioxide that they're producing is then put back into the blood, and so the extra carbon dioxide can then be sent back to the lungs where it's excreted into the air. The key thing to remember in an exam question is really just to talk about more of things happening, more blood being sent to muscles, more energy required, more respiration taking place, more oxygen, more glucose. So if we're thinking about the effect of exercise on your physiology, we can think of one of the key ideas being the increase in your heart rate and why that happens. And we know the heart is pumping the blood's carrying the oxygen, we need more oxygen for aerobic respiration. One of the important things that we need to understand is this equation here. Now, this cardiac output is described as the volume of blood pumped by a ventricle in 1 minute. Okay, that's your cardiac output. Because whether it's coming out of the right ventricle or the left ventricle, don't worry about the structure of the heart yet, that's later in B2. The volume of blood leaving the right ventricle is the same as the volume of blood leaving the left ventricle. They're the same, otherwise you'd have problems with too much blood going one direction and not enough coming back. So it's always just a ventricle. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase this parameter. We're trying to make the cardiac output as big as possible so that we get a high rate of blood flow to the muscles so they're carrying more oxygen and glucose. And the cardiac output is two things. Cardiac output is your heart rate, which is beats per minute, so the number of times in 60 seconds that your ventricle is contracting to squeeze blood out into the arteries. And the other thing is your stroke volume, and this is the volume of blood ejected by a ventricle each beat of the heart. And so if we know the volume of blood that's being pumped out each time the heart beats, and we know how many times it's going to beat in a minute, what we can do is we can add up all of these individual beats, multiply them together, and what we'll get is your cardiac output. We want to make this as big as possible. And as long as we can increase the cardiac output by increasing the heart rate, and that's the thing that goes up, this is what's going up when we exercise, then you are going to deliver more oxygen. There is a limit to that though. The heart can only beat so many times per minute, and then we start to get problems. So what are those problems? What happens when we reach a limit on the amount of times your heart can beat and the amount of oxygen we can deliver. Well, let's look at this diagram, which looks a bit sort of scary at the moment, but we'll break it down into different sections. So this is interesting, the resting oxygen consumption. This is the amount of oxygen your body needs when you are sleeping, for example. And because it's fairly low, we can deliver that using aerobic respiration. Glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water. And remember, the big thing here is that you get lots and lots of energy. Okay, and energy comes out in units called ATP. And for every molecule of glucose, we get 38 ATPs. All right, and that's when we're at rest. And then let's imagine for a moment here we start to exercise. So suddenly you jump up out of your seat and you've got to run out of the room. And what you can see is that this red line shows the amount of increase in your heart rate. Okay, so you can see when you start exercise it's fairly low, it rises quite quickly and then reaches that maximum level. But the problem is it doesn't go up straight away. So when you start to run, your muscles are working harder, they need more energy, so they need more respiration, they need more oxygen. But you can't deliver that. That purple box shows you the difference between what you need, the requirement, and what you're actually able to supply through increasing your heart rate, and with it your breathing rate. And so we build up what's called an oxygen deficit. And the problem is that with a lack of oxygen, you can't carry out aerobic respiration. So you have to look at a different system. And the system we go to is this system. And this is called the anaerobic respiration system. And what you're doing is you're breaking down glucose. Notice there's no oxygen here. And you're producing this molecule, lactic acid. Now, the reason you do this is because you get out some energy. You actually only get out 2 ATPs per glucose. Note, aerobically 38, anaerobically only 2. So you get much less energy than you would otherwise expect. Another problem is that this lactic acid is a poison. And as it builds up in your system, you start to get cramp and you start to feel fatigued. So if you were to sprint, you can only sprint for a certain distance because the buildup of lactic acid stops you working any harder. And this purple box, this oxygen deficit, has to be repaid. You can't suddenly say, well, I've got all this lactic acid and I'm going to forget about it. So once you stop exercising, here, you now have built up what's called an EPOC. An EPOC stands for an excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And what that really means, if you think about it, is that this black line, remember, was the amount of oxygen that you needed when you were at rest. So any oxygen you're consuming above that amount, so all this bit here, must be excess. And we finished exercise, so it's excess post-oxygen consumption. And what's happening is the oxygen that you are breathing in extra, so imagine you've just sprinted, you've stopped sprinting, and it's those big deep breaths that you're taking when you're hands on your knees, bent over, and you're really working to get air into your lungs. And what that oxygen is being used to do is to break down the lactic acid. Now this is happening at the liver, and what you're doing is you're breaking down the lactic acid with this extra oxygen that you're still getting into your system, into carbon dioxide and water. The carbon dioxide can obviously be put back into the blood, sent to the lungs and breathed out. So this is extra oxygen. That's the key thing. You're consuming oxygen just to stay alive, but because you built up an oxygen debt, an oxygen deficit, when you exercised much harder than you could actually afford to do, I suppose. Your heart rate wasn't high enough to get the oxygen to the muscles quick enough. You had to go anaerobic, and as a consequence, you build up this oxygen debt. And the EPOC is you paying it off. Okay, you have to stay alive, so you needed some oxygen anyway, and this is the extra bit of oxygen that you required. Now the size of the EPOC depends on two things really. It depends on how long you were exercising anaerobically, so how much lactic acid you built up, and that again, in turn, depends on how fit you are. The fitter you are, it tends to mean that your heart rate can increase more and you're better at delivering oxygen to your muscles. So you're going to go anaerobic much later than somebody who perhaps unfit. And if you are fit and you've got a stronger heart, then you're probably going to pay off your EPOC much quicker because you can pump that extra oxygen around your body that much faster. But remember, whether you're fit or unfit, your heart rate having increased during exercise will remain higher than your resting heart rate and breathing rate until you've paid off your EPOC. That's because you need to deliver that extra oxygen to those muscles to remove the lactic acid.